congratulate the organisers for holding a workshop on the establishment of a legal framework to ban nuclear weapons, which is very important to look at. I was listed on the programme as a coordinator of parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, which is true, but a lot of my work in exploring and developing the legal framework to ban nuclear weapons has been in my role as a consultant for the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, the Japanese affiliate. The Japanese Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms is here. I'm going to be giving an overview, so I won't be going into much depth on any of the areas, but to give an idea of the range of aspects of the legal framework from which our individual panellists will be able to pick up certain aspects and go into depth. I'll be looking at three key areas. One is the legal norm or norms for abolition. Two will be the types of legal instruments to ban nuclear weapons. And three is the political pathways and approaches to build the legal framework for the global abolition of nuclear weapons. Starting with the legal norms, there are a couple of aspects in looking at the norm for abolition. One is affirming the norm or what the law that already is, what exists, and two is strengthening or building on that norm. In affirming the norm, we can look to a range of sources. One is the International Court of Justice 1996 advisory opinion. Another is the Vancouver Declaration that was developed by a group of international lawyers in February 2011 on the law's imperative for the urgent achievement of a nuclear weapon-free world. And there are other sources also, like the resolution of the International Committee of Red Cross of November 2011. And I'll talk a bit also about criminality as part of that. Looking first at the International Court of Justice advisory opinion of 1996. This was very important in the world's top legal organ examining the status of international law and how it applied to nuclear weapons. While the decision may not have been perfect, it took us a long way down the road to affirming a norm, a strong norm against nuclear weapons. The court applied international humanitarian law, as well as treaty law, and other laws of peace and security, such as Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, to nuclear weapons in order to come up with its decision. While international humanitarian law was a very strong part of it, it wasn't the sole source of law in determining the final result of the court. The court stated that the destructive effect of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in time or space. Now, this was a very important evaluation of the court, that nuclear weapons are unique in their characteristics. This is something which I know Hibakusha have been talking about for years, and others of us, but to have the International Court of Justice affirm this is very important and helps us in our campaigns. From there, the court went on to say that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be illegal. Now notice they talk about the threat or use. If the law was just based on humanitarian law, you've got very strong law on the use, or prohibiting the use. But the threat requires additional law to assist that. And in particular, I mentioned Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. But also adopting other legal principles that if an act is illegal, therefore the threat to commit that act would also be illegal. And the court drew on legal principles in order to make that determination. So this was important, that the court did not just determine that the use of nuclear weapons would generally be illegal, but also the threat. Then the court went on to affirm, and this was unanimous, that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. This again was very important. It's stronger than Article 6 of the NPT. In fact, first it clarifies Article 6 of the NPT, because the nuclear weapon states until 1996 had been saying, well yes, we know Article 6 is about nuclear disarmament, but it's also about general and complete disarmament. And so we really can't achieve nuclear disarmament until we have general and complete disarmament. This decision from the court split those two, basically says there's an unconditional obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. It's not based on whether you can achieve general and complete disarmament. But secondly, it says the obligation is not only to pursue negotiations, but to bring them to a conclusion. And it has to be on nuclear disarmament in all its aspects, the complete abolition, prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. It's a very strong decision from the International Court of Justice. That then paved the way for the follow-up resolution from the United Nations General Assembly. It was the United Nations General Assembly which requested the opinion from the court, so it was in the mandate of the United Nations General Assembly to consider how best to implement that decision. The General Assembly picked up primarily on the obligation for nuclear disarmament and says in order to implement that, the states need to begin negotiations leading to the conclusion of a nuclear weapons convention, which prohibits development, production, testing, deployment, stockpiling, transfer, threat or use of nuclear weapons, and providing a program for their complete elimination. This resolution is adopted every year by the United Nations, and over the years the support has grown. So last year, when it was put for the vote, 135 countries supported it, and that includes some nuclear-armed states, demonstrating that there is a capacity to engage with some nuclear-armed states on the idea of a global treaty, or a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons globally. And then move on to the Vancouver Declaration, which is more recent than the 1996 Royal Court opinion, in the sense it looked at some of the developments in international law since 1996, affirmed that nuclear weapons use could not comply with international humanitarian law, and that the prohibition of nuclear weapons use also includes retaliatory use in response to nuclear attack. And said this is undermining any rationale for holding on to nuclear weapons for nuclear deterrence. That the prohibition of threat of use thus applies in all circumstances. And also affirmed that there's a strong customary norm developing against the possession of nuclear weapons. And this was followed up not long later by the resolution of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which again reaffirmed the international humanitarian law, and that any use of nuclear weapons could not really be compatible with the rules of international humanitarian law, and appeals to all states to pursue negotiations to prohibit the use of and completely eliminate nuclear weapons. Another aspect is the criminality, which is very important. This is looking not just at what it is illegal for states, but also for individuals. It's a very important part of implementing international norms now is to apply those norms universally, not just to states but to individuals. There is a UN resolution which is adopted every year, put forward by India, which calls any use of nuclear weapons a war crime, not just illegal but a war crime. Mexico has proposed to the International Court of Justice that the use of nuclear weapons be included under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court as a war crime. And there's a global citizen campaign supporting the idea of criminality of nuclear weapons. This is a presentation of some of the affirmations to the UN High Rep on disarmament. Now moving on to legal instruments to establish the framework. I mentioned they can be adopted at different levels. You have national instruments, national legislation, regional instruments such as nuclear weapon-free zones, like-minded instruments, and the ban treaty is an idea of that, a group of like-minded states getting together to prohibit nuclear weapons, and then global instruments. Global meaning that they would require participation or at least application to all states. Under the global, there is partial bans. So, for example, the resolution I mentioned before, put forward by India, calls for a partial step, an international convention prohibiting the threat or use. There's another proposal that's been put forward for a framework convention, which will provide, and it will be an agreement of states on the framework for eliminating nuclear weapons, but would leave all the details of that, the phased, how many years it would take, all the verification procedures to later agreement. But at least it would lock in the commitment to the elimination of nuclear weapons. And then there's a comprehensive approach, which would be the Nuclear Weapons Convention or package of agreements. Now, these are not necessarily in opposition to each other. In fact, they can be done side by side, and in some ways that's part of the political discussion of how to focus on these different types of instruments. I'm going to explore a little bit of the elements of the global framework, and this is being outlined in a number of ways, but primarily through the Model Nuclear Weapons Convention, which was drafted first in 1997 and then revised in 2007. And it was drafted by an international group of legal and disarmament experts brought together by the Lawyers' Committee on Nuclear Policy. It's modelled very much on the Chemical Weapons Convention, i.e. that it has, at the start, a prohibition on the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and then a phased program for the elimination of the existing stockpiles with verification, compliance, and enforcement mechanisms. So the Model Nuclear Weapons Convention explores the range of elements that will be required for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. The legal mechanisms, technical, institutional, and political elements. It's available in the book, Securing Our Survival, The Case for a Nuclear Weapons Convention, and that book also includes discussions about how such a convention could be achieved, what are some of the outstanding questions to be considered in establishing such a convention. As I indicated, it was drafted in 1997 and revised in 2007. Both of those Model Nuclear Weapons Conventions were submitted to the United Nations General Assembly and circulated as UN documents. The 2007 one was also submitted to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee in 2007 and was included in the 5-point plan of the UN Secretary General, or mentioned, should I say, in that plan as the starting point for multilateral negotiations. And then more recently, the Model Convention was submitted again to the Open-Ended Working Group at the United Nations in Geneva. What does it include? I won't go through in detail all the elements, I'll just outline them generally. We've got a number of sections. One is on the general obligations. Basically, they are the negative obligations, what you're not allowed to do, and the positive obligations, what you're required to do. For example, these are the sorts of details that are in the Model Convention on the different prohibitions and then the obligations that will be required. But I'm not going to go through all these. You can read those in the convention, the Model Convention itself. I'm just going through that overall outline of what the different aspects of the model are. Another part of the convention looks at the phased process for disarmament, understanding that the nuclear weapon states wouldn't agree to give up all their nuclear weapons in one go, that they would agree to more likely agree to a phased process where they agree on proportionate reductions, and they can verify that each is keeping to the agreement and then move on to the next phase. It would include aspects on verification, inspection, and compliance. Also, there would be a process for resolving disputes. If there is a claim that another country is not fulfilling its obligations, then there's a process for raising that, for presenting evidence, for evaluating that and coming to some conclusion. And then if it is discovered that there is non-compliance, then there are enforcement mechanisms. We would hope it wouldn't be like this, that the enforcement would be more in the lines of collaboration to ensure compliance. You may recall that the former US high-level reps, Secretaries of Defense and State, Kissinger, Nunn, Perry and Schultz, said that the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons is like the top of a very high mountain. It's very difficult to see the top, and perhaps we can only take little steps to start the process up to the top. Well, what we see is that the Model Nuclear Weapons Convention actually provides some idea of how you would get to the top. It gives some idea of the types of problems and challenges and how to overcome them in order to reach a nuclear weapons-free world. Support for it is quite global. I've already mentioned the UN resolution. Abolition 2000, the global network of organisations that was established in 1995. At point 1, the primary call of Abolition 2000 is for a nuclear weapons convention, and over 2,000 organisations have endorsed this call. Abolition 2000 also commissioned a number of opinion polls over the years that demonstrate that public support a nuclear weapons convention, including in the nuclear weapons states. There's high-level support from various areas. I've just mentioned 3 here: the Interaction Council, Canadians for a Nuclear Weapons Convention. It's over 500 Canadians who've received the highest order of Canada, and Australians, I think it's over 700, but Tilman might be able to correct me on that one. Recipients of the Order of Australia have supported the Nuclear Weapons Convention. Parliamentarians and parliaments have supported, including through a joint statement of parliamentarians around the world for a Nuclear Weapons Convention, and the resolution of the Interparliamentary Union in 2009 supporting the UN Secretary-General's 5-point plan, and Mayors for Peace make the achievement of a Nuclear Weapons Convention part of the 2020 vision. I just mentioned the Interaction Council because it gives you an idea of some of the high-level people who are now coming in behind the Nuclear Weapons Convention, who used to be very cautious about it. And this was their meeting in 31st of May, when you have people like Bill Clinton, Gro Brundtland supporting the Nuclear Weapons Convention. Final section I work on is the political pathways, how to build this framework. And there are a number of different forums in which nuclear weapons could be negotiated. One is the Conference on Disarmament, which was specifically established for negotiating multilateral disarmament treaties. Another is the United Nations General Assembly, and there's a couple of examples arising from there, such as the Open-Ended Working Group or a specific negotiating conference. There's a like-minded process, such as how the landmines and cluster munitions were negotiated, and then there's the idea of a P5-led process, which is what Global Zero has been advancing. Looking briefly at the Conference on Disarmament, it has been successful in the past. It's negotiated the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but from 1996 until 2013 it was blocked. There was no substantive work done at all. In August 2013, it was established an informal working group. Hasn't done anything yet, but let's see what happens in 2014. Maybe it will be unblocked, maybe it won't. Part of the process to unblock this, or at least to get the ball rolling while the Conference on Disarmament was blocked, was the establishment by the UN General Assembly of the Open-Ended Working Group. It was open to all governments and to civil society, and it was very refreshing that as civil society we could participate in the Open-Ended Working Group pretty much the same as the governments. We could make interventions, we could submit working papers, and so we were very much engaged in the process. The group stimulated new proposals for taking forward multilateral negotiations For example, the building blocks approach arose out of this. That was submitted by Japan and some other countries, and seemed to provide an opportunity to bring in the two divergent opinions of a step-by-step process or a comprehensive process. The building blocks are sort of a hybrid of the two. And now forwarding the proposals to the General Assembly and the Conference on Disarmament. The open-ended working group stimulated a civil society action around the world, opened the door to a nuclear weapons-free world. We had students, high-level officials, such as former heads of government. There we have Gorbachev, I think. Youth, the Arms Down campaign, managed to get 20 million signatures from religious youth around the world supporting a nuclear weapons convention. Mayors for Peace, were sending in videos or photos to support the process. On the UN General Assembly mandated process, we've had a couple of examples: the War at Sea Convention, the International Criminal Court, and the Arms Treaty, Trade Treaty, were all negotiated through a General Assembly approach. So we have possibilities arising from that now. The like-minded approach, I mentioned before, cluster munitions and landmines treaties were done in that way. On nuclear weapons, where ICANN is advancing this proposal of a like-minded group doing a ban treaty, and I think Tilman will talk about that. And in the P5 process, Global Zero is promoting this process. They're not the only ones, but they've put a definite timeline on what the nuclear weapon states should be doing as reducing numbers of nuclear weapons, paving the way for negotiations on a global treaty. And there's a lot of support developing for the Global Zero. I've got over 300 influential leaders who supported it, and just recently over half of the members of the European Parliament supported the Global Zero plan for the elimination of nuclear weapons. A lot of these ideas about the elements for a nuclear weapons-free world and the political process are explored in the academic world, and some of this is brought together in the Nuclear Abolition Forum, which is both online and hard copy magazine. The two issues so far have been on international humanitarian law and on moving beyond nuclear deterrence. So this is a summary of what I've outlined, that for building a legal framework, we build on existing norm for abolition. There are a range of legal instruments that can be adopted, and there are some political pathways to move these forward. Thank you very much.